All right, hello and welcome back. I guess we're starting off right away. Yeah, there it is. Hello and welcome back to the Advocate Sports Updates. I'm Wilson Alexander, your LSU football writer, over here at the Advocate and Times Pick, joined by my colleague Leah Vann. LSU, of course, is coming off a 24-23 loss in the season opener to Florida State. Third straight year now, LSU has lost its season opener. A lot to get to. We're going to look back a little bit on that game, but in a way that also looks forward, because I think everybody is probably tired of just hearing about how poorly everything went and wants to maybe know a little bit more about how those things are getting addressed and whether or not it's really correctable. And so that's kind of the theme of our show. Thanks everyone for tuning in. If you have questions, please drop them into the chat and we'll try to get to those near the end. But let's get started first with Mason Smith, because I think that's really kind of the biggest news of the week. And really is going to be a big thing to watch throughout the season is how LSU responds to not having their star defensive tackle, the 6'5", 250-pound sophomore out of Houma, Louisiana. He's done for the year with an ACL tear, and this is not something that can be just lightly overlooked, I don't think. So, Leah, what do you make of what LSU is going to do on the defensive line without Mason Smith?
Yeah, I think what stood out to me was, I think on the very next play, we saw BJ go down, and everybody was like, oh no, but BJ Ojulari will be fine. I thought what was awesome was the way Mekhi Wingo, stepped up, and he even got that fumble recovery towards the end to really give LSU the opportunity to put together one more offensive drive and try to win the game. He's one of the players that we actually got to talk to at preseason camp. And so he's already made strides as a leader. He leads the conditioning competition and kind of holding himself accountable as a team leader. So I'm excited to see what he brings to this defensive line. I know there's a bunch of other names, but what about you? What do you think? What elements does he add and other players that might add?
Yeah, Mekhi kind of lucked into that fumble recovery. I don't know what Florida State was doing, running a toss dive on the end zone with like a minute left. That didn't really make much sense. But hey, LSU's going to take it all day long, and Mekhi did a good job of capitalizing on that. Mekhi's interesting because he's not physically Mason Smith. Brian Kelly said it yourself. Mason Smith is a great player, and you're not just going to be able to replace him and plug and play. It's next man up mentality and all that kind of thing that coaches talk about. But Mekhi Wingo is, he's 6 foot, he's 295. He's got a really low center of gravity. It seems like he does a pretty good job of getting up underneath offensive linemen in their pad level and doing a good job of kind of dropping his. But he's not the former 5-star recruit who could end up being like a first-round draft pick, like Mason Smith is. Maybe it develops into somebody like that. But he had 6 tackles against Florida State. He was an All-SEC freshman with 27 tackles, a sack, and he actually even had an interception he returned for a touchdown. He said that during the preseason, like you mentioned, we got to talk to him, that he was learning a lot about how to kind of take on double teams and really improve as a run stopper. And that's what LSU is going to need him to do. He's going to have to do a good job of gap responsibility, which is something that, as good as LSU's defensive line has been in terms of just sort of talent on paper the last 2 years, they've sometimes struggled with that. And even it looked like at times maybe against Florida State, a little discombobulated in moments, but they did a good job of keeping Trayshawn Ward contained. He rushed for less than 4 yards a carry. I think it was 41 yards or thereabouts on like about 16 or 19 carries. And so
actually, sorry.
No, go for it. What you got?
I was looking through the Pro Football Focus run defense grades, and if you actually look through it, Mekhi Wingo was one of the top 4 players in run defense. So maybe there's something to like that element. And I had a good relationship with the Iowa defensive line coach when I was covering that team, and leverage is huge. Being able to get under and really lift a guy up and just kind of get him off his feet. And so being someone who is a little bit smaller, if you have the power and you're able to use it the right way, he could be incredibly effective on this defensive line. So, obviously every team has big losses. I think the next man up, it'll be interesting. It's certainly a storyline that I'm interested in.
Yeah, it's going to just be vital to what LSU does the rest of the year, because all the thing coming into preseason camp was the defensive line. This group is the best group on your team. We know it's got some depth, like with Mekhi Wingo, and Jacobian Guillory is another name to keep an eye on. He was a part of that rotation against Florida State at defensive tackle. But, you lose a key guy in that rotation, Mason Smith. And we're going to have to kind of just see how it plays out and how LSU adjusts. But it's not a loss that can just be overlooked. And shifting gears, I think I don't know if there's anything else really to add about Duke's line. We're going to kind of have to see what they do. But obviously, another big kind of person to dissecting this game was Jaden Daniels. Makes his first start for LSU. Jaden finished 74.3% completion percentage, 209 yards in the air, 2 touchdowns. Most importantly, perhaps no interceptions, no turnovers of any kind, and he also rushed for 114 yards. It was quite a debut. A lot of it came in the fourth quarter to sort of lead that comeback. I came away really impressed with Jaden's sort of resolve physically. What he's got, obviously speed. You saw that on the first play, what he can do with your legs when he broke out for 25 yards because LSU ran everything off to the right. Florida State had their backs turned to man coverage, and Jaden just slipped out for a big gain in that first drive. But it was kind of up and down overall. He's going to have to continue to improve. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts on his first start as well. Yeah.
What I thought was really interesting was looking at the stats here. He put together 84 of those rushing yards were after contact, which is huge when you have an offensive line that is still trying to find its identity and find that cohesiveness. And so on average, he could gain 6 yards after contact, according to Pro Football Focus, 6.46, which I thought was really that's really important. That is definitely why he won this job in the first place. And I think you mentioned this too, no turnovers that were his fault. No interceptions. We've seen interceptions across the board in college football this weekend as, quarterbacks are shaking off the rust. 74% completion rate when he did throw the ball. And I think he ended up throwing the ball more than Florida State's quarterback towards the end of the game. So I think, he was incredibly impressive given the adversity that he faced and the pressure that he faced. I think that he really is the real deal and the perfect fit for LSU. So going back and watching, I think if they get that tempo going, I think LSU could really amplify its offense these next couple of games.
Yeah, he was, let's see here, the exact stat. I've got it. You talk about Jaden Daniels' start, and there's some comparisons to Joe Burrow, the first QB in LSU history to pass for 200 yards and rush for 100 yards in a game decided in regulation. Joe Burrow did it in a 7 overtime game at Texas A&M, of course, in 2018, a game that LSU fans don't want to remember for good reason. The one thing I think that we have, it wasn't just like a perfect, holistic, fantastic, start. He gave LSU a chance to win the game at the end, though, and I was probably most impressed with that last throw because we saw Jaden having to – sometimes he lowered his gaze way too early and took off running, and that's some kind of a tendency that you have with him because that dates back to his days at Arizona State. But he hung in the pocket. LSU gave him protection, and he waited. It looked like he worked along – we don't know the exact read progressions if you don't know the name of the play, but it looked like he sort of waited – looked around the field, and then saw Dre Jenkins and delivered a perfect throw there in the back of the end zone. Dre made a great catch as well. But the thing that I think really stood out for me in Brian Kelly's press conference yesterday was this idea of how Jaden needs to continue to improve or recognizing fronts. And it ties into what you were saying on the offensive line, that once Florida State had a 3-man front and dropped 8 into coverage, Jaden recognized that and really knew how to attack it because they were often playing in man. And so he was able to run the football well and then really lead that 99-yard drive. Now, not every team is just going to rush 3, drop 8. And so it sounded like part of what he needs to do, and that what they need to continue to coach him on, is like recognizing the fronts that he is getting, which could then help the offensive line, especially if they're using that tempo. It's kind of all complicated and convoluted. Of course, we're talking about offensive schematic stuff here, but it seems like that's what LSU's going to need to sort of do moving forward is use that tempo. Jaden's going to have to continue to improve on recognizing those fronts and put those linemen, slide protection if he needs to. And a lot of those, I think what we're going to maybe shift gears into next, which is just the offensive line in general. The idea, I think we're going to go through a few different things here of there's a lot that went wrong in this game. What's correctable in the season, 2 weeks in, and what is not? What is going to be an issue maybe that lingers throughout the year and could end up really being an Achilles heel? I think let's start with that offensive line. They've got guys who are playing all for the first time. People, when you talk about the offensive line, you often talk about cohesion, LSU is building that on the fly in the middle of the season. You asked Brian Kelly another question about that today in the teleconference about offensive line awareness is what he calls it when everybody's kind of playing together. How important is that going to be? And maybe how is LSU trying to develop that?
Yeah, and unfortunately, I've learned a lot about this, and unfortunately it comes with time and reps and playing together, because to have that instinct of what the man next to you is going to do, I mean, it just takes time. And the bottom line, there's a true freshman at left tackle. And then you've got a couple of transfers on the interior, and then you've got a guy playing center who's never played center. And then you've got Anthony Bradford, who was kind of out last season, in and out. And so really I know that they had spring, I know that they had fall, but also they didn't really have the lineup fully cemented throughout this entire offseason. And so now it's going to be super important that all the same guys stay in those same spots and start to learn each other's tendencies and start to figure out how to work together as a unit. And unfortunately, that comes with playing together. And this is when you come into the idea of okay, this is when you want to play an FCS team, right? Week 0, right? Florida State had that opportunity. And then LSU now has an opportunity to play a team like Southern and maybe play some other teams that are out of conference to kind of develop that chemistry in a little bit of a lower pressure situation. So I think, that's something that, if we saw last year too, the offensive line improved towards the end of the season. There's a reason for that.
Yeah, it did. Brad Davis did a pretty solid job with that group, getting them to play better over the course of the year. Some of that was also, of course, schematically. LSU started doing different things with some, gap zone runs that they weren't using at the beginning of the year with those pulling guards, but it really worked. And this year he's got a difficult job on his hands to try to bring this offensive line together that has not, like we said, ever played before. Interesting, Brian Kelly said today, that they're going to always be continuing to evaluate personnel. He was asked directly, are you going to make a personnel change on the offensive line? And I don't know how quickly that's really going to feasibly come, because while LSU has some other options, like you think about Marcus Dumerville, he's a former top 100 recruit that this staff likes as a tackle. Maybe Cardell Thomas maybe gets a look at guard, maybe Emory Jones, but again, that's another true freshman that do you feel comfortable putting him in the lineup as you go into the SEC this early? You kind of have what you have in terms of personnel to an extent, and they feel better about the two deep, but I think it would have to really take a lot to maybe upend that and try something new. It's going to be interesting to see what they do schematically to maybe work around that, use that tempo, that quick passing game, which is what led to those 3 touchdown drives at the end. It kind of, I'd be curious to see if Mike Denbrock tries to go that, early in this Southern game and early again against, Mississippi State, because maybe in that way, this whole thing about they didn't get out the gate fast against Florida State. Maybe actually literally using tempo to go fast. Maybe that helps them kind of move forward. In terms of whether it's correctable in the course of the season, like you said, it's going to take time. And this could be something that we're talking about for weeks on end, is what LSU does there. Shifting gears to special teams, I think. Another question, whether or not this is correctable. We saw LSU have a field goal blocked, a PAT blocked, 2 muff punts. There was a penalty on a kickoff and a shake punt. I'm of the mind that this is all stuff that is correctable, and if done properly, should not show up again. Do you agree or not?
Yeah. Even I feel like statistically, it's rare for it to happen twice in one game. I've certainly never seen that twice in one game. But I think it also has to do with blocking and shaking off the rust. And I think you do have Brian Kelly did note that he made a personnel change and there was no difference in the result. There was at first, because LSU was able to make a field goal, or I think it was a extra point without a problem. And then towards the end of the game, with that personnel change, the same thing happened as before. And so it did work, and then it didn't. And so I'm interested to see if he's going to stick Emory Jones, like we said, was back in there. I can't remember who else it was. I wrote about it yesterday, but yeah, it's going to be interesting to see who he puts on the line, if he makes a personnel change, or if he says, you know what, we're going to stick with it and you're just going to get reps because at this point you are who you are. And I think the same thing applies to the offensive line. I thought what was interesting today and what was the punt return conversation. I thought what was really cool was, which, it didn't work out, but Brian Kelly was saying, I wanted to show Malik Neighbors that I was confident in him and stick him back in the game at that position. Of course, he muffs the second punt, but even today he was saying, I'm not going to rule it out, like putting him back there again. But he also said that Sage Ryan, which he told us during fall camp, also has experience in not only that, but on offense. And so he could also be an electric person to put back there. And I think we saw on like the kick returns and stuff, we saw Evan Francione out there a few times. Like some of these younger guys could take on that opportunity to really step up and make a name for themselves. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, Evan had a good preseason. He's certainly not a younger guy. He's been here for a minute now, but he is a walk-on who could actually end up maybe getting out there. Javen Nicholas is another one. He's a true freshman, walk-on who is one of their options at punt returner. I'll be curious to see what they do with Sage Ryan because Sage has a lot of athleticism. He was used all over the field in high school. And if they don't go to Malik, that's probably who they go to next at punt returner. But you're right. This is an interesting window into how Brian Kelly is going to coach. Because, he's been on this national scene for a long time. But up close here around LSU, of course, everybody's seeing him for the first time. You've got a case here, Malik Neighbors, where, you didn't hear a word of anything wrong in terms of, production on the field in the preseason. Like it was just people raving about Malik Neighbors. And for good reason. He looked phenomenal. There's no discussion about a drop. You saw it. At first, his hands early in the game, they ran a little bubble screen. Jaden threw it high and out to the outside, and Malik Neighbors went and plucked it out of the air. He's got good hands. There was something interesting. Someone on social media sort of asked, I wonder if the Superdome lights kind of got in his way. I would be interested to know that. We haven't heard from Malik, so we don't really know. But it was that's just what made it so bizarre. Because he'd been so good, but you're seeing what Brian Kelly is managing him now. He did not mince words when saying we made a bad evaluation by putting him back there, especially a second time. And that was maybe a little bit harsh, but now you're seeing, okay, we're going to continue to get him work there and try to, build that confidence up. Cause this is still a young player who, while extremely promising, has only played a year of college football and is now going into second week of his sophomore year and needs to continue to kind of have that confidence and continue to foster that. And it'll be interesting to see kind of how Brian Kelly and his coaching staff manages it because if he can just cleanly catch a punt, he's liable to go to the house. He's really fast. He's dynamic with the ball in his hands. And also as an aside of that, you kind of saw LSU already doing that. First drive on that, right after that muff punt, they get the ball back with Mekhi Wingo. Who gets the ball in the next two plays? Malik Neighbors. So I'll be interested to see what they do with him moving forward here. I do think it's correctable. They're going to start doing some different drills where they have a lot more noise right in the punt returner's face to make sure that they are catching the ball and used to doing that. The penalty, that's something that you can clean up pretty easily with coaching. That's a young player in Harold Perkins who was in his first game. The shank punt, that happens sometimes. We saw that Jay Bramblett hit like a bomb earlier in the game, and so he'll probably be okay. The other two issues, we've gone over the offensive line. The other one, you're writing about it today, is third down defense. LSU was not good on third down. Their defense was not, I would say, fantastic overall, but you just really got exposed on third down because they could not wrap up and bring Jordan Travis down to the ground. Is this something that should be a concern throughout the year, or is it, okay, one game they struggled on third down and maybe this won't be as much of a problem, but it was really specific to Jordan Travis and what Forsyth was doing?
I think it's a little bit of both because Brian Kelly was saying Jordan Travis was a really elusive quarterback. He is the kind of guy who can break tackles, and then he can also throw the ball. What I noticed was most of those balls, and I think Koki pointed it out yesterday when he asked, most of those deep passes on third down were right in the middle. And so I think that's something about changing your coverages. I think that also Brian admitted that they threw some stuff that he was not ready for, that he was not, that they did not use last week. And most of the third downs they were able to convert came from 8 yards or more. And which I found fascinating because they would, because they always they would either run the ball or they would throw it deep. So, I mean, it was to me, like, it almost was easier if it was like a 3rd and 3 for LSU to defend and stack the box and kind of use that aggression. But as far as coverage goes, I think that secondary, and I think Brian Kelly spoke to this, is there's some work to be done in the secondary, which normally is an LSU strength. So I have no doubt that's going to get sorted out. And I think it's just first game jitters. But there were some clear gaps really right up the middle on all of those 3rd down plays.
Yeah, they've certainly got some holes to shore up. Like you mentioned, secondary, they need better communication. This was something that everybody talked about as a strength from Major Burns, but Brian Kelly said, especially out of safety, we need better communication, and then a lot's going to fall on them to do that. They're going to be able to begin to shore up some of this stuff against Southern. Like you said, this is kind of a whole week in terms of when you're just thinking the game itself is about a lot more than just the football game. But when you're talking about just like LSU football, what to expect on the field, this is a lot about like, okay, what do we need to do to work on ourselves? LSU is bigger, it's more athletic. Just because of the guys that it recruits, it should be able to handle this game. But the game itself, I don't think will be maybe the star of the show. Halftime, that should be awesome. With whatever is cooking with those 2 bands, and just the atmosphere around Baton Rouge should really be something to behold on Saturday as these 2 teams. LSU is playing at HBCU for the first time that these teams have ever played each other, despite being in the same city as long as they have. And we're going to have a lot of coverage about that. Before we sign off, Leah, any parting thoughts about the Florida State game and what is to come this season?
I thought the very interesting point to like leave off on looking forward to this week is like, how many times do you see 2 big football teams from the same city play each other? Like maybe USC, UCLA is what Brian Kelly used yesterday. I think that's kind of an interesting trivia question. And being from Fort Worth, like it's TCU, SMU, but they're not in the same city. So I think that this weekend, Baton Rouge is going to be popping, and I'm here for it. I'm really excited and looking forward to it.
Absolutely. We're going to have coverage of all of that for you over at theadvocate.com and NOLA.com. You can find all of us on Twitter as well. And then also think about signing up for the newsletter. It shows up in your email inbox, I think, every single morning. And it's not just a football thing. We have that newsletter going year-round. We cover baseball, basketball, women's basketball, men's basketball, all the basketballs, gymnastics, track and field. If something's happening with LSU Sports, we'll have you covered. So thanks for watching, everybody. We'll be back right here, 2 p.m. next week, breaking down that Southern game. Looking forward to LSU's SEC opener against Mississippi State. Signing off for everybody at The Advocate, I'm Wilson Alexander. This has been LSU Sports Updates. Thanks for watching.